Dr. Buffano coming at you with another lecture on Latin American politics. Now, this is my second lecture in this series on the politics of Latin America. So check out that first one if you have not watched it yet, because that first one offers an introduction to the region. Now, in this second lecture, we are going to be discussing the pre-colonial legacy in Latin America. In other words, what impacts did the civilizations of indigenous peoples have on the present in Latin America? And why does variation exist across the region? Now, there's a couple of reasons why I'm starting off this series of lectures with this topic. Number one, obviously indigenous peoples, right? We're talking about the first peoples that inhabited the Americas. It's a nice way to kind of get started on our discussion on the politics of the region. But there's also another good reason as well. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about indigenous peoples in this part of the world. There are some folks out there that might think that most of these people got wiped out due to Spanish colonization, and thus their cultures are no longer relevant, or that their politics is no longer relevant, or that it's just a relatively minor issue. But as I'm going to show you today, that's not the case. In fact, many indigenous communities survived colonization, and many continue to exist after colonization ended and had an impact on the present. But there are differences across indigenous peoples in the Americas. So this is something that's very important. There are cultural, economic, and political differences. We're going to understand some of the basics of this today. And we're going to understand how and why different indigenous communities had different types of political and socioeconomic institutions on the eve of colonization, right? So why did some indigenous communities have large and complex empires, whereas others consisted of small bands of hunter-gatherer communities? So we're going to try to understand why these differences existed. And finally, we're going to understand how this legacy impacted the present in terms of socioeconomic and political development, right? So things like rates of economic development, literacy rates, that sort of thing. Indigenous communities are not all the same. Now, while it's true that people of European descent are much wealthier on average than indigenous communities throughout the region, there's a lot of diversity within indigenous communities. Some communities are wealthier than others, and we want to try to understand why that's the case. And this also helped me really solidify to you that there's variation across this region of the world. So before we kind of jump into Latin America, I want to just introduce to you a very basic theory. And by the way, there's an academic paper that goes with this. I'll discuss that academic paper at the very end of this lecture. So this theory basically argues that the nature of pre-colonial institutions impacts what we know as development. Okay, so it goes like this. The more developed your pre-colonial institutions are, the higher levels of development you will have in the present. That's the basic idea. Now, of course, is this universally true? No, there are other factors that impact economic development and political development out there. But this is one potential variable to explain differences within countries and across countries. So we have to define a couple of terms here. First, what do we mean by developed pre-colonial political institutions? Well, the more developed your institutions are, well, this means that you have more organized government, you have organized bureaucracies that engage in things like tax collection and record keeping, you have a social class stratification with different professions, you have organized militaries, you have things like infrastructure and organized urban planning. What these things do is they give communities more organization and more political power. Okay, so of course, not all pre-colonial institutions were this developed. Not all of them had pre-modern states. Some of them lacked organized government. Hunter-gatherer communities, for example, lacked organized government at all. They have more informal forms of figuring out how to deal with political disputes within their communities. This means they are less organized, they are less powerful. Now, pre-colonial political institutions that are well developed also tended to have well developed pre-colonial economies. You cannot have an empire like the Aztec or the Incan Empire without high levels, at least in terms of the pre-modern world, high levels of agricultural production, right? So you need to be able to grow food and produce an agricultural surplus. Now, why is this necessary? Well, if you want to have people that are engaged in things other than hunting and gathering for food or growing food, you need to have enough surplus food to then give to those people so they can survive. So if you want soldiers, bureaucrats, if you want merchants, if you want to have an organized leadership hierarchy, there needs to be agricultural surplus. And you also need to have trade networks because those farmers need to find ways to get food to people in cities, right? So you need to have trade. And of course, these developed pre-colonial economies, they're going to have larger populations, they're going to have cities. This is also what enables for the emergence of technological development and more sophisticated political systems. Now, why does this matter for the present? Well, according to this theory, if you have more economically and politically developed pre-colonial institutions, you're going to have more development in the present. This means you're going to have a higher GDP per capita, average salaries will be higher amongst individuals, greater access to public goods like education, healthcare, you're going to have higher life expectancy. It means these communities are going to have higher levels of political development, more civil society activity, higher rates of voting and participating in social movement activity like protesting, for example. You're going to have higher rates of development. Now, why? Why would that pre-colonial legacy matter, right? Well, first, it goes based on the assumption that, of course, colonizers don't always completely wipe out the people they colonize, right? And you're more likely to survive a colonial conquest with your land or your life intact if you have higher levels of political and economic development, if you could put a better resistance to colonial rule, if you have larger numbers that can withstand massacres or the spread of disease, you are more likely to survive colonial conquest. Your populations are going to be higher. And even though you might get conquered by those colonizers, they are more likely perhaps to give you more autonomy. They're more likely to respect some of your pre-colonial traditions, your economic traditions. They might be more willing to intermarry with your elites. They're more likely as well to exploit your labor less, right? If you could foment more rebellions against them, this means they might tax you less, right? So that you don't rebel as much. So by giving more autonomy, this in turn as well can ensure that you have higher levels of economic development. And of course, this will apply after independence as well. So after the colonizers leave, the country gains independence, those indigenous communities that have higher levels of development are going to be able to engage in more social movement activity and protesting. They're going to be able to represent their interests better to the government and thus get more spending on public goods, such as schools, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So if you have higher rates of pre-colonial development as an indigenous community, you're more likely to have higher rates of development afterwards. So that's the basis of the theory. So let's now apply this to our Latin American case. So to do this, we first have to discuss indigenous peoples and where they came from. Now, what you're seeing here is a map of the first migration routes to the Americas that started approximately 12 to 13,000 years ago. We're not 100% sure on the exact dates here, but this is what the archaeology tells us are the approximate dates. These people during the last ice age crossed over what is called the Bering Straits from what is now Russia into North America, and then slowly migrated south over the following millennia. And of course, these people were hunter-gatherers, right? So they hadn't developed agriculture yet. They lived in simple nomadic or semi-nomadic communities, usually no more than about 120 people without organized government, right? And so they migrate in search of animals, plants to eat, good pasture land, and thus they go across these two continents and they start to populate them. Okay, and over time, their numbers start to grow. And because they were the first peoples to come here, we know them as indigenous peoples. Okay, so that's what really indigenous means. You're the first to get there, the first to settle in that particular place. So they're the first to arrive. And they go by a variety of names, these collection of peoples. They're often known as Amerindians. Of course, in the United States, we know them very commonly as Native Americans. So they were the first to get here on the continent. Now, here's the thing, though. The civilizations they eventually formed in the following millennia were incredibly diverse. They're going to diverge. They're going to develop different languages, different cultural traditions, as well as different types of political systems, ranging from hunter-gatherer communities to complex empires. And so this is, by the way, just a simplified map of, a good chunk of these civilizations prior to European colonization. So you see groups like the Inca and the Maya and the Aztec here. So the Aztec, very famous empire in central Mexico, centered on what is Mexico City today. You had a Mayan civilization based in parts of Central America and southern Mexico, as well as Incan civilization in the Andean highlands, okay, what is now Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. So you had a lot of these complex civilizations with great variation across time and place. And they spoke a great variety of different languages, many of which survive to the present. So you have for example, the Nahuatl language. The Nahuatl language, okay, found here in central Mexico. You have the Mayan language. You have the Quechua language in the Andean highlands here and what was the Incan Empire, the Zapotec language in southern Mexico, and the list goes on, right? So we've got lots of different languages spoken here. These were not a single peoples, right? They consisted of a diversity of different groups. And part of why they diverged economically and politically has to do with where agriculture was domesticated and where it wasn't domesticated, as well as where agriculture tended to flourish more, okay? So the most important crop that is indigenous to the Americas was corn, okay, otherwise known as maize by the Native Americans, right? Corn is very nutritious. You can grow it in large quantities if the climate is right. And it was first, domesticated as a crop in Central America, and where eventually the Mayan Empire would be created. And eventually it spread north to central Mexico first. And of course, this is where eventually Aztec civilization would emerge. And it then spread to Southern America, to the Andean highlands, where the Incan Empire would emerge. And these places tended to have relatively temperate climates in the highlands, whereas in the lowlands, where you had a lot of tropical climate, high temperatures, places that weren't as favorable for settlement or for intense agricultural production, tropical regions, such as in Brazil, you did not see the same high levels of agricultural production in the pre-colonial era. So as a result of this, some places developed agriculture earlier than others and more agricultural production, and thus more complex civilizations. And by the way, corn, really important crop, right? So when you think of Latin American cuisine and you think of tortillas, tacos, enchiladas, we think of things that are made of corn, right? So of course the quote unquote the breads, right, of these different cuisines, they are made from corn. A very important crop. In fact, it's still a very important crop for the U.S. economy and many other economies throughout the globe. Now, it wasn't the only one, right? So you also had crops like potatoes, tomatoes, avocados, and so on and so forth. So you did not, however, and this is important, going to be important for next class, you did not have much in the way of domesticated animals. And we're going to talk about why that was the case and why this is going to matter in the next lecture. And so you could see here on this map where agriculture was more intense. And these dark green areas is where you had more agricultural production. In the Indian highlands, so in the mountain ranges where temperatures were more temperate, you had higher rates of economic development and thus the development of complex kingdoms and empires, right? Whereas in these areas that are not green, heavy tropical regions, they're in the lowlands, you're going to end up with lots of hunter-gatherers, as well as what is called subsistence farmers. That is, farmers that can produce surplus crops to feed other peoples. And so thus, you're going to get different levels of political development. Indigenous civilizations are going to develop different levels of political complexity, all right, that are going to be dependent on these varying levels of agricultural production. So some of these communities are going to consist of hunter-gatherers. Now, who are these folks? These are folks that don't stay in one place to grow food. Instead, they migrate to hunt their food and gather it, okay? And this is far less efficient than farming, okay? And so if you don't have the ability to farm or access to agricultural crops, this is how human beings had to survive. In fact, for most of our history as a species, this is how people survived. And because you can't produce large populations with it, populations are small, and pretty much everybody's involved in the same thing. Hunting and gathering for their food, you're not going to get complex civilization here. You're not going to get complex government. And the way people are going to resolve their disputes is going to be, involved in using more informal tactics. Think about it from this perspective. You know everybody in the community. In fact, you're probably going to know everybody, okay, that lives in your community by their first name. You're going to be able to work out your problems one-on-one, and you're not going to find much economic inequality in these communities either. You're not going to find private property. There's not going to be the need for organized, complex government. Now, things do get a little more complicated once agriculture emerges, but at first, when agriculture starts to emerge, people aren't producing much in the way of surplus crops. Subsistence agriculturalists are those who produce just enough agriculture to survive. And while they're settled down, they're not living in complex cities. They're living in small villages, once again, with relatively small communities. Government's not going to be very complicated, right? And so you're not going to have a written language. You're not going to have complex government. And this is the way most Amerindians lived before colonization, including the Native Americans in the United States. Most communities were either subsistence agriculture or hunter-gatherers. They lacked significant agricultural surplus. These communities, as a result, when they encounter Europeans, are going to be very weak, okay? They're going to be very much vulnerable to conquest as a consequence, right? And so in Brazil, most of the populations consisted of hunter-gatherers and subsistence agriculturalists within this country. Now, as surplus agriculture starts to grow, you're going to start to see the growth in complexity. In what we call chiefdoms, you're going to have large communities that consist of multiple villages with at least one city. And this is going to be a social hierarchy, right? Where some families have more wealth than others and more dominance over others. Now, in simple chiefdoms, it might only consist of a few villages in a city. It's not that complex. It's not spread over thousands of miles, maybe only over a few dozen miles. But it's more complicated, this civilization. It involves a hierarchical structure. These communities can mobilize more people than a hunter-gatherer community. And just to give you some examples of this, the Muisca of central Colombia are an example of an indigenous community that had these chiefdoms with more complex architecture, and they also had more social classes. They had some trade and artisan crafts, so much more complicated than our hunter-gatherer communities in Brazil, for example. The Zapotec in southern Mexico are another example of these type of communities that had chiefdoms. Then finally, our final level of complexity gets to pre-modern states. These are complex empires that had complex governments with formally written laws. They had complex bureaucracies with record keeping. They had a complex hierarchy with a monarchy and very large populations with urban planning. And so when you think of these civilizations, you can think of Mayan civilization in Central America and what is today Guatemala, Honduras, and southern Mexico, and places like Chiapas. We also think of as well of Aztec civilization in the central Mexican plateau where Mexico City is located today. And so the Aztecs had a very complex empire with a hierarchy. And it was quite a brutal empire, right? So just like empires in Europe during this time period, they conquered, they exploited, they tried to impose their faith and their values on others, and they ruled over a diversity of different indigenous peoples. And finally, Incan civilization is located in the highlands of Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, as well as some parts of Colombia as well. They also had this massive empire, and it was the most developed out of the three empires. So you had very complex civilizations in some parts of Latin America. Right. And so let's just kind of visualize this a little bit. Take a look at Brazil here. So this is kind of what you're looking at when you think of like subsistence agriculture or, a hunter-gatherer community, very tiny communities. Notice with tropical rainforest, it's difficult to control the environment in these places, not as comfortable for human habitation, lots of parasites and disease. It is going to be more difficult to establish agricultural surplus unless you have the right types of crops and technology, okay, which is only going to come later in history. And in fact, in the interior of Brazil today, in some parts of the rainforest, you still have autonomous indigenous communities, many of which are hunter-gatherer communities that still exist. And while there are hundreds of these communities, they're all very tiny for the most part. In fact, indigenous peoples only make up less than 1% of Brazil's population. So you have hundreds of these tiny little communities in Brazil today, as you can see on this map. Now, in contrast, the chiefdoms, these small villages, surrounded by a city or two, right? They tend to be a little more complicated, spread out over a slightly larger territory. They have more people. The Muisca of Central Colombia is an example of this. And notice how the architecture is a little more complicated. Notice we start to see the basis of cities emerging with city walls. We're getting more sophisticated here in terms of the development. And this civilization also left behind a lot of artisan goods and crafts. So they had a merchant class, much more sophisticated. And there are various communities that were found in the Indian highlands in Colombia like this. And then we move on to our complex civilizations. So the Maya of Central America, we can see on the map here. Notice here how they had complex architecture and complex city life, and they had organized religious faiths and with complicated traditions, right? And so we can see here the complicated stone architecture, for example. And you can't build stuff like this unless you have complex government with tax collection and with artisan craftsmen and large populations of labor to be able to build this stuff, as well as a social hierarchy, right? So you need elites above commanding those down below to engage in the hard labor to build this type of stuff. And we see the same thing with Aztec civilization. So Aztec civilization was located in central Mexico, as you can see on this map. The Nahuatl, which is the main language that was spoken by these people, and you can still find it today in this part of Mexico, and it has a big influence on the Spanish language as well in this part of Mexico. They formed a very big civilization in central Mexico, a complex civilization with monumental architecture and complex urban planning, as you could see in this kind of illustration. And we have a lot of descriptions as well of their complex urban life by the Spanish conquerors who came there. And of course, they as well, the indigenous peoples, eventually recorded their own history for us. And so thus, we know a lot about this civilization. It was complex. It had hierarchical social stratification. Same was true of Incan civilization in the highlands of the Andes Mountains. And by the way, these places, because of this monumental architecture, are now tourist sites within Latin America today. And so in Peru, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, as well as parts of Colombia, we found Incan civilization. And as a consequence of this, the Quechua speakers, the main language of this empire, are found scattered throughout these countries. And in Bolivia, over 60% of Bolivians' population consist of indigenous people, and about 25% within Peru. So you have where you have more complex civilizations, you have higher population densities. In today's world, that means you're going to have a larger percentage of people being from these indigenous communities as a consequence of this. So we could see on this map from the study that I'm going to talk about a little later, the darker regions of Latin America on this map had more complex civilizations. Now, the authors of this study rated civilizations on a scale of 0 to 4, 0 being bands of hunter-gatherers with no government, 4, you have a complex empire, right? And with, of course, large populations and agricultural surplus that go with it. And so you can see here in the highlands of the Andes, in central Mexico and Central America, you had more complex civilizations than in places like Brazil here or Argentina, where the indigenous populations were far smaller and they tended to engage in hunting and gathering. So how did this affect the present? Well, we have to kind of understand the different abilities of these different peoples to respond to colonization. So the Spanish and the Portuguese started their conquest of Latin America in 1492. First with the Spanish, later the Portuguese came, and over the following centuries, they conquered Latin America. Now, they did not do it overnight. Some communities resisted more than others. The Spanish and Portuguese were more interested in some regions. And of course, coastal regions came first before the interior. And there was a lot of violence and death involved in this. Over 50 million people died due to the spread of disease and warfare. Okay? And in the aftermath of this, the Aztec and Incan empires were destroyed. Latin America was gradually conquered. And for the indigenous peoples that survived, much of their labor was exploited in what the Spanish called the encomienda system, right? So you had a lot of death, starvation, spread of disease, lots of labor exploitation here. But here's the thing. While the Spanish did try to spread their language and their religion, their way of life, as did the Portuguese to these indigenous peoples, many indigenous communities survived. Many of their languages survived, their communities, and some of them had more political power than others under colonialism and in the aftermath. Okay, their level of development differs in the present. And for those that had stronger pre-colonial institutions in the Andean highlands, in central Mexico, and in Central America, they were more likely people in those communities to survive the period of colonial conquest. By the way, some communities didn't survive. You had, for example, in the Caribbean islands, you had some entire communities that were sometimes wiped out by warfare and disease. But in other places, like the Indian highlands, lots of people survived. And these communities as well were more likely to keep some of their autonomy. Now, of course, they did get conquered, but because it was tougher to conquer them, and because they as well frequently put up rebellions against colonial rule, Spanish and Portuguese authorities would be more likely in these cases then to give benefits to those communities, perhaps more autonomy, less taxation, more benefits. They were more likely to intermarry with those folks. In fact, this concept, the Republic of Indians, is used here, for these kind of autonomous communities. Now, these communities would often have to give things in return. They might have to give the Spanish some taxes or labor for their encomienda system. They might marry some of their elite women to Spanish conquistadors, but they did keep a lot of their autonomy in many cases. And much of their language and culture was preserved. Their communal solidarity was preserved, okay, as a consequence. And because of this, it enabled these communities to occasionally rebel if the Spanish authorities ever tried to abuse their authorities. And in the aftermath of colonialism, after independence, they were more likely as well to be able to rebel against state authorities and form social movements all the way up until the present day. And so as a result of that, they were able to demand more from governments. And they were able, as a consequence, to get more schools built in their regions, more hospitals, more investment in infrastructure, and thus they're more likely to have higher rates of socioeconomic development. So that's the basis of how this theory works here. And so you could see this in a number of ways. So take, for example, this map of indigenous populations. Notice how indigenous peoples form a larger percent of the population in some countries in comparison with others. So in the Andean highlands, take for example the case study of Bolivia, over 60% of the population is indigenous. In Guatemala, in Central America, where Mayan civilization was located, over 40% of the population is indigenous. And in Mexico, that number is about 15%, although the numbers are higher in central and southern Mexico. Now, compare this with Brazil, where less than 1% of the population consists of indigenous people, or Argentina, where the number is only a little over 2%. So there are great differences in terms of indigenous populations. And when you got larger populations and more population concentration, it becomes easier then to create a social movement, to mobilize against repression. And you also see as well, these people keep their cultures, and they also had a greater influence on the colonizers themselves. In fact, throughout Latin America, you do not have one Spanish language. Instead, there are many Spanish dialects. And so if you go to southern Mexico, for example, you will find a lot of Nahuatl words within the Spanish language. In fact, our words for chocolate, chili, tamales, avocados, even the word Mexico itself, Mexico, for you gringos out there, it came from the Nahuatl language. So they had a great influence, these indigenous peoples, on various Spanish dialects wherever you go. In fact, as you can see from this chart, basic words differ across the different Spanish dialects across Latin America today. And a lot of this has to do with differences in indigenous cultures. And, just to give you an example of how this impacted the present, well, take, for example, the province of Chiapas in southern Mexico today, where you find a lot of Mayans. Now, Mayans were not the only indigenous peoples in Chiapas, but they're one of the main groups. So different groups of Mayans there today. They had a complex civilization there before the Europeans got there. They put up intense resistance to Spanish colonization. And while they were eventually conquered, they kept a lot of their traditions and way of life. And as you can see here in this image on the top right, indigenous peoples kept many of their clothing traditions, their languages, their land holding traditions. And as a consequence, they were able to put up greater resistance not only to Spanish colonial rule, but to post-independence Mexican rule. In more recent history, in the early 1990s, a group of indigenous peoples in Chiapas formed what is called the Zapatista movement. And we're going to talk about this movement more later in the semester. But this movement, they mobilized in response to the government's cutting social welfare benefits and government spending in the early 90s, as well as opening up to free trade with the United States and opening up to private companies privatizing land and trying to destroy indigenous communal holdings. So the Zapatista movement emerged as a movement to protect indigenous autonomy in an age of globalization. So in these places where you have higher levels of pre-colonial political and economic development, you have higher levels as a result of political development in the aftermath, as well as a consequence, economic development. This will be the final chart I show you. Take a look here at this chart. What we're comparing here is indigenous populations that have completed primary school across countries and across urban and rural areas. Now, notice a couple of things. Number one, in Indigenous peoples that are found that are more concentrated in urban areas have higher rates of primary school attendance than in rural areas in every country across the region. Okay, so Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and so on and so forth. So there is internal variation amongst indigenous populations in these countries. And in parts of Mexico where you had more complex civilization, you have higher rates of urban development as well as educational development today. Now, on top of that, there's variations across countries that are absolutely fascinating. Let's compare Bolivia and Brazil here. What's interesting with Bolivia is it's one of the poorest countries in Latin America. Brazil, in contrast, is much more economically developed than Bolivia. It's more industrialized, more urbanized. Yet, the indigenous peoples in Bolivia have higher rates of economic development than those in Brazil. Right. Of course, as we talked about, there are far more indigenous people in Bolivia as a percentage of the population than in Brazil, but their rates of literacy are also higher in both urban and rural areas. In fact, Brazil has lower rates of development than most other countries in Latin America amongst indigenous peoples. And that's the key word. Now, remember, indigenous peoples in Brazil are less than 1% of the population, right? So we're going to talk about the rest of the Brazilian population a little later in the semester. But at least amongst indigenous peoples, they are not as well developed. We've got lots of hunter-gatherer and subsistence agricultural communities in Brazil today. So we see great variation within countries and across countries amongst indigenous peoples. Now, one last thing here that is important to keep in mind, the Europeans who are going to come and colonize, they're going to have far higher rates of economic development than indigenous populations. And countries that have more indigenous peoples are going to have lower rates of development than countries that have more Europeans. Okay. And so we're going to talk about why this is the case next class. So we do have to keep that in mind, right? So while there's variation amongst indigenous peoples, they do tend to be poorer than Europeans. Now, where did I get a lot of this information from? Well, of course, as a researcher, I do a lot of academic studies, but I want to recommend one really cool study to you. This is by Luis Angeles and Aldo Elizalde. They published this work in the Journal of Development Economics in 2017. It's titled Pre-Colonial Institutions and Socioeconomic Development, the Case of Latin America. I highly recommend checking it out. All right, so that does it for my lecture today. I will see you all at my next lecture. It will be on the Spanish conquest of the Americas and the impacts it had on Latin America. See you all next time.